Hey guys, Habiba here. Welcome back to my channel. I'm back at you with another book review. So, in today's video, I'm going to be reviewing this novel called By the Sea by Abdulrazak Gurnah. And he's the most recent winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature. Those of you who love literature, I'm sure you've heard, but for those of you who don't know, he's the winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature, right? Yeah, and the book has that sticker on it. He is a Tanzanian or Zanzibari British writer. So he's originally from Zanzibar, which is part of Tanzania. And he's also British because he's been living in Britain for decades. So that's where he resides. But yeah, and I bought this novel at a very wonderful bookstore in Ottawa called Octopus Books. Shout out to Octopus Books. Wonderful, wonderful bookstore. If you're ever in Ottawa, make sure to check it out. All right, so let's jump into the book review. The genre here is literary fiction. So fiction, literary fiction. It's essentially the story about a very strained relationship between two men. So we have Umar Saleh and Latif Mahmoud. These are the two protagonists in the story. So it's about their very complex relationship. And it's also a story about a very complex family drama. So the narrator, the author, Gurnah, he weaves this very complex family drama that he explains and he breaks down over the course of the novel. And it's set against the backdrop of post-colonialism and migration. So as he tells us a story, we're taken into Zanzibar's post-colonial period, right? So we're taken back there, and then we're brought back to sort of more contemporary times when these two characters, so these two men who have a very strained relationship, when they happen to meet in a British seaside town. And this novel, By the Sea, it's quite nice because, the title, By the Sea, is quite nice. It's a very interesting title, very poetic, but it also, when you read it, you realize that it refers to two seas. It's talking about, Zanzibar, which is an island. So it's talking about the sea off the coast of Zanzibar. So that ocean, I guess, the Indian Ocean, but then also the British coast. So two seas, the Zanzibari coast and the British coast. All right, and now some very quick notes before I get into the plot a bit more. And also what I like about the narrative is that this story is character-driven. So it's a character-driven novel. I found that it's told in a very strong voice. I love the author's voice, very strong voice, very thoughtful and very cerebral. When you're reading it, you realize that the author is very, very cerebral. And so if you like that, if you like thoughts and sort of dealing with thoughts and being taken into other people's thoughts, this is for you. And you have to be patient at times as he sort of brings us into his thoughts and lays out some of his thoughts for us. Yeah, and at times he really lays out his thoughts at length. And I think that as a reader, you need to be patient when that's happening in the novel. Another point, it's a very poignant story, very heartfelt. At times, there are moments where he just pulls you right in emotionally, and you find that you're having a lot of sympathy for the protagonist. The New York Times book review did call the story extraordinarily moving, and that's written right here on the cover page, extraordinarily moving. So it is very moving. It's a very poignant story. And one thing I wanted to say earlier when I said it's a story about this complex or this strained relationship between these two men is that it's also a story about perception, about interpretation. How events are interpreted, how stories, how things in the past, things that really happened, how they're interpreted. Because, each of these men, so I said Umar Saleh and Latif Mahmoud, they both have their own recollection of the same events from the past, right? And each recollection is different. However, both recollections are correct. So, they both have different interpretations of what's happened in the past in Zanzibar. Their families knew each other. They weren't family friends, but anyway, their families were involved with each other. And that involvement went south, basically. It turned into like very damaging, very destructive involvement. And Latif Mahmoud, who is a young professor, he's a young professor in Britain. He's a literature professor. His family was very damaged, was very badly affected by what happened. And so now these two men, they have a chance encounter decades later in the UK, when Umar Saleh, who is the older of the two men, happens to migrate. He's a refugee in the UK. He's an asylum seeker, and they call, his caseworker happens to get in touch with Latif Mahmoud, who's the English prof in London. Yeah, he's in London. Calls him to interpret for Umar Saleh, the older of the men, because he's a Swahili speaker, Latif Mahmoud. Anyway, so he visits him in the seaside town, and that's how they meet again after all these years. So when they meet after all these years, it's an opportunity for both of them, but more so for Latif, the English prof, to sort of get straight on what happened, to hash out certain things from the past. And he has a lot of grievances to air in regards to what happened to his family at the hands of the older man, at the hands of Umar Saleh. Even though, as we learn later in the novel, Umar, the older man, he wasn't really, he did act poorly. He made some poor choices, as he himself states. He himself acknowledges that he made certain poor choices and that he could have acted differently. But he wasn't, let me put it this way, he wasn't the architect of the disaster that befell the Shaban family. So the family of Latif Mahmoud. This Umar Saleh, he wasn't the architect of that disaster, right? So very interesting, very intriguing drama that takes time to play out. And the drama of the story sort of plays out through this conversation of the two men, because as they're both sort of sharing their recollection, and like I said, they both have different recollections, both are correct, right? And so when they're meeting in Umar's seaside apartment, and now they're both sharing their recollection, we're taken back to Zanzibar when all of this was happening. And that's how the drama of the story plays out. So the story is told by both characters. We start with the voice of Umar Saleh, the older man, and then it transitions to Latif Mahmoud, and then there's some back and forth between both voices. We have a lot of sympathy for the character, or at least I did as a reader. I can't speak for other readers, but I found that the story was told in such a way that as a reader, you develop this sympathy for Latif Mahmoud, the prof, right? As a result of his family dysfunction. There's so much family dysfunction. And his estranged brother Hassan, whom he misses dearly. He misses Hassan dearly. And his family, back in that time in Zanzibar, they were sort of forced to give in to those who sought to humiliate them, to sort of succumb to sort of just what was happening and their circumstances. And it was a weakness that Latif, that he detested. And he describes this, the character Latif, when he sort of discusses what was happening and how his parents responded to all that was happening, to that disaster, as I referred to it earlier, that disaster that befell their family. And how his parents responded to it. He found that his parents responded very weakly, and that there was just sort of this weakness, and he really detested that. All right, so next part of this review, I want to talk about what I really liked in the novel. So just off the bat, one thing that I really loved was the prose, very rich prose. Like I said, the voice was very, what did I say earlier? Very thoughtful, very cerebral. I really think you need to be patient as a reader to really appreciate this novel. But I really love the prose, and I'm gonna, share some examples from the text with you. So let's jump to, here we go. I liked how the character of Umar Saleh, so this is the older man, I loved how he spoke about his deceased wife and his deceased daughter. So they're very dear to him, they're beloved to him, and it's quite sad that he had to lose them. They died while he was in jail in Zanzibar. So that's where some of the post-colonial stuff comes in because of what was happening at the time in the post-colonial era, and some of the governments that were around. And so he happened to be jailed, and it was during his jail term that his wife passed away, and then later his daughter, in that order, I believe it was. Anyways, throughout the novel, as he's narrating, he often refers to them, and it's actually, I'll come to this in a second. So, on page 60, he tells us about his daughter, how she didn't live long, and his caseworker in the UK reminds him of his daughter because his daughter would have been her age. So if his caseworker is in her 30s, his daughter would have been that age had she survived. And he just speaks of her in such a kind, in such a very beautiful way. And then even as he's speaking about her, when he's done speaking about her, he always, he asks for God's mercy to be upon her, so that's there in the book too. So obviously he's really missing her. Yeah, and then on page 190, he talks about the wife Salha, whom he didn't know very well before their marriage because, one second. I'm just going to turn off my fan there. He didn't know her very well before they got married. Then they got married, and he loved her so much. And he says on page 190, and I knew then what a desert my life had been before that. Listen to that. I knew then what a desert my life had been before that, and learned the sweetness of silence between companions. Because he says, they would often just sit together. What did they do? Yeah, they would listen to the radio, they would play cards, they would just sit together in silence. And he talks about when her friends would come to visit, because she would entertain a lot of her woman friends and all that. But he felt that they were stealing her away from him. So he wasn't particularly keen about their visits because he felt they were stealing his wife away from him. So really nice. So I really like that, how the character of Umar Saleh, how he speaks of his wife and his daughter. And it's very interesting because now through the eyes of the other character, the prof, and there are so many characters in this book, by the way, but I'm just I'm really focusing on these two, but there are a lot of characters, guys. These two are the main characters. Yeah. So in the eyes of the other character, Latif, this man, Umar, he's quite wicked, he's he's a high-level wicked because of his role and what happened to his family. But then when we hear from Umar in his own voice, we're sort of exposed to this softer side of him, this softer side where he's a man who's very in love with his family and so forth. And we realize that he too was dealt some bad cards, if you will. But, he too had his own tribulations in life. Another thing I like, right? So on page 154, Latif, he becomes friends and roommates with a young man named Ali. Yeah, so this is in GDR, Germany. In the book, it's referred to as GDR. So I understand that was East Germany. So it also gives you a sense of when this was happening, when he's studying in Germany. So Latif, the character of Latif, he studied on a scholarship in Germany, and he meets a young man, fellow student, who becomes his roommate named Ali from Guinea Conakry, and he talks about the rain. The character Latif, he talks about the rain in Conakry. So quote, page 154, it says, he talked about Conakry, the great port, and how hard and long the rain fell in that city. So I had to bookmark that because I found it really so amusing. I found it so interesting that the Conakry rain actually made it into this novel. You know, it's quite funny. For those of you who know Conakry, it rains heavily during the rainy season. I think that it made it into this. It's quite telling because it just tells you how heavy the rain is during the rainy season, that it even made it into this novel when Latif is telling us about his roommate from Conakry. So I found that to be really, really cute, you know. And then on page 155, so right after that, so actually still on 154, Ali tells Latif that his brother was disappeared by, you know, the Guinean government at the time. He was disappeared by the government. And anyway, then Latif shares how his brother too had disappeared, and not by the government, but his, he writes, I told him that I too had an elder brother who was lost somewhere over the horizon. So when you guys read this novel, you'll realize that this character Latif, he's really, I don't want to say mourning the loss, but he's really lamenting, let me put it that way. He's really lamenting the departure and the loss of his older brother Hassan. He has this older brother Hassan. Hassan leaves the family, you know. I'll let you guys read why and what was happening in the family, and sort of a third person who inserted himself into the family and whose kind of presence in the family was very destructive. Let me put it that way. Very, very destructive. But as a result of all this, Latif, he loses his older brother Hassan. So he says, I too had an elder brother who was lost somewhere over the horizon. And I underlined that in the book because it was really so sad. And throughout this story, we really feel his pain, his sorrow at the departure of his older brother. So I like that there in terms of the prose and the feeling that was evoked right there. Very, very rich prose. The book is also really funny, guys. So like I said, it's very heartfelt. There are some very sad moments. There are also some very funny moments. Very, very funny. He's a funny author. Page 212, where we're in Umar's apartment. He's giving his recollection of what happened, the events from the past. And now he's telling a story about Latif's father. Yeah, so he's telling a story about Latif's father, Rajab Shaban. This Rajab Shaban, he accused Umar Saleh of basically wreaking so much havoc in his life, taking away their possessions. It's quite complex how it happened, so I'll encourage you to read the story itself so you can figure out now how they became enemies, really. So anyway, as we're in the UK and he's narrating this story, and he says, he stared at me with surprise and perhaps a little terror, and for a moment I thought he would weep or let out a cry and flee, So the way he describes certain events, but especially the way he describes the character or the reaction of Rajab Shaban is really funny. And like I told you already, Latif, he's very bothered by his parents, what he perceives to be their weakness, how they respond to certain events, to certain things that have happened to their family, to this disaster that has befallen their family, how his parents respond, in particular his dad, because his dad has really, he's caused it, It's his dad's actions that are the root cause of the disaster that's befallen the family. He's really annoyed and very upset by how his dad responds. And then on page 213, he writes, "Oh, really? I can't believe that God could have made someone as wicked as you." And with that, he slid into the bright sunlight and disappeared, So you can kind of see what's happening there, and it's really quite hilarious. He was shouting at the top of his voice by now, pointing and spitting at me, walking backward toward the doorway, as if he feared I might rise and attack him, So it's really funny, the way he describes the father's reaction to all of this. On page 306, we witness, and I say witness because the way it's told quite visually, the return of Hassan, this older brother who was lost over the horizon, as his younger brother Latif put it. So Hassan returned to Zanzibar years later. And now by the time of his return, he was a grown man. When he left, he was still, he was quite young. But by the time he returned, he was a grown man, right? Now his younger brother, Latif, had already left. Whether he was in Germany at that point or whether he had made it to the UK at that point, I can't remember the timeline or if we even know. But basically, the younger brother had left Zanzibar, so he wasn't there to witness the return of his older brother from the Gulf region. All right, so the return of Hassan, it was quite dramatic, very important, and quite nice that he returned. And like I said, his younger brother, Latif, was always wondering, always so curious, wondering what happened to his older brother. And so he's quite relieved when Umar Saleh explains to him that Hassan did return and he witnessed a return to Hassan and what happened upon the return. You know, it's very interesting to find out what happened upon Hassan's return, because he comes back, like I said, as a grown man, and he's more empowered, and because of what happened to his family and to his father, he was very, he really wanted to avenge his father and avenge his family, which he does a little bit. Yeah, so that return of Hassan, it was quite nice, As a reader, I felt happy for for Latif, for the protagonist Latif, because it was something that bothered him for so many years, just not knowing what happened to his older brother. And so even though in the novel we never saw him meet up with his brother again, at least he we get the impression that he's relieved knowing that his brother did return. So it was a great read, guys. I encourage you to read this book. And this was my first book, the first of his books that I've read. Yeah, it's my first time reading an Abdulrazak Gurnah novel. And so I'm going to read more of his books. And when I saw that he won the Nobel Prize, that's how I came to know of his work, actually. Yeah, so I'm going to read more of his books. Some central messages in the book are the interference of a third party. Yeah, interference of a third party. That's very key in the book. You got to read it. And how sometimes third parties, they can insert themselves and cause such damage in people's lives. And that's what happened in the Shaban family, the Shaban family. And then also how one person too, because yes, a third party did insert himself, but the father, Rajab, Shaban, Mahmoud, his actions, like I said, were what led to the disaster, were what caused the disaster. Yeah, there was a lot happening. It's really a complex story of deceit, and there was that third party who caused so much damage. He was a Persian merchant named Hussein. I didn't mention him. I kept alluding to him, but he was a Persian merchant named Hussein, and he's the one who kind of inserted himself, but he scammed a lot of people as well. He was also a scammer merchant. And so that's how the disaster started, and there were loans involved, and it became very complex, very messy. So that's one of the key messages, like the interference of a third party. Also post-colonialism, I spoke that it's set against a backdrop of post-colonialism, and sort of how post-colonialism, sticking with this idea, this theme of third parties. If you think of the colonial powers, the Britons, the France, in the case of Zanzibar, Tanzania, it was Britain. If you think of how these colonial powers interfered, in the lives of millions, billions of people across the world through their colonial conquest, through their imperialism, that too was an interference of a third party. These colonial powers, they were third parties who interfered with so many nations, so many peoples across the world. So there's that, Yeah, also, as I mentioned earlier, perception, perception, how we understand events, how stories are told, from whose perspective, that's very key, from whose perspective are they told. It's a very, very interesting book, a lot to be gained from it. Very philosophical at times, like I said. All right, everyone, thanks for watching. I really enjoyed this book review. Yeah, check out my previous book review, Kamara Lay, The Dark Child, L'Enfant Noir. Very interesting. Yeah, check it out. I'll link it here. Remember to like, to subscribe, to leave comments, and see you in my next video. Bye.